My name's Ted Terrasas. I work with the Monterey County LEA. I have done, several of our programs in the county as far as locals, medical waste, all kinds of that, those types of things, waste tires. So you've probably seen me around, whether you like it or not. But now, today I kind of want to talk a little bit about the closed landfills in Monterey County, and specifically kind of the juxtaposition between Fort Ord and some of our historic closed landfills that were basically pre-Subtitle D before a lot of regulations came into, well, really any regulations were in place for what happens at a closed landfill site. We have about 17 closed landfills in the county. The majority of them are unlined and uncapped, about 20 plus years on average, more or less, since they've accepted any waste, so they're very old. They often contain burn ash, since due to the fact that that was a standard practice at the time, was basically to take the material out there, burn it, and sometimes bury it, sometimes not, and then keep that process up until they had filled the site. And actually, it's kind of interesting because Monterey County, although we only have about 500,000 people in the entire county, just about every small town around the whole of the county has its own little burn dump or one or two little dumps that they've had over the decades. So that really spreads us out. It takes us about 2.5 days just to go from one to another of our closed landfills in the county. So also no gas or water monitoring. So basically we don't have a lot of information about what kind of impacts currently are going on at these sites. Essentially they are older, so we're hoping basically that their worst days are behind them, but we don't really have any data to back that up for a lot of them. They're not required to do testing. As you can see, that last point there, health risk is unknown. That's kind of an issue we'll get to later in terms of how the post-closure land use comes into effect. And also the boundaries of waste are suspect. I kind of bring that up because when I first started going out to these sites, it was sort of like a Native American ritual where they you need to go out with a guide, and they say the landfill is between the pine tree and this rock and that dog. So hopefully the dog doesn't move, but it was very very word of mouth. Luckily nowadays we are getting GPS equipment. We can go out there and actually walk the site, and generally we'll just go in a very wide area to be sure that we'll take the area that we believe the waste to be in, and then go beyond that just to be sure we're not missing anything or hadn't been misinformed over time, short of taking cores to be sure of where the boundaries are. Here's an example. This is our Fort Hunter Liggett site down. This is a military installation where they still do practices. And you may have heard, unfortunately, they did have an accident, a fatality with a couple F-18s there a few weeks back. And this is in our county, in the southern part of the county, kind of just north of the San Antonio lakes. But they do have a closed landfill out there from the previous activities at the base. And from here you can't really tell, but there is kind of a row effect. They have each little cell is kind of in its own row, and you can actually see these little things here are just gas vents to the open air. And one good thing about this site is it's right next to the roadway for the base, so there is kind of a lot of visibility. People do drive right by it a lot, so if there's any issues or any daylighting of waste, something like that, at least it'll be something that somebody would most likely report, as well as the fact that they do have an on-site hazardous material operations manager that does do these random inspections, as well as, of course, they do water monitoring out here, even though they're not required to at the time. Also, here's a site in Sand City, which is right in front of that little strip mall. There's a Borders and a Circuit City you may have seen on the way into Monterey. Just on the other side of that, along the walking path, there is a landfill that was right underneath it, and actually so close to the ocean, in fact, that at one time it was dropping waste into the ocean, basically, kind of sloughing off a bit into the bay there. So they actually, the board about 10 years ago, funded a project to quasi-clean close the site, basically kind of dig up the material, see where the limits of waste were, characterize the waste, make sure nothing was particularly hazardous. This is one where kind of a little more characteristic of what we see in Monterey County, where these sites are really out in the middle of nowhere a lot of the time and don't get a lot of attention until I go out there. And the kind of, you'll get the nearest kind of development or activity people, nearest receptors are, quite a ways away. There is some development over here a bit to the left, some new development, but it is still a significant ways away. But ideally, when you go out to these sites, you don't want to know that there's a closed landfill out there. When I take people out there, I try to see if they can point out where they think it is, because the idea is you really don't want to know. You want them to be blending back in with the topography and with the growth on top, things like that. And, of course, no daily lighting of waste or any residuals where you would expect to find a landfill there. So Soledad is kind of one of those situations. But the thing is, you also get that. See that the site security back here in the back, basically that's all you get is a little barbed wire fence, which doesn't really keep people out, as I can attest to. I've forgotten the keys a couple times and had to go through that sucker. Ruined a couple shirts, which I think I have to talk to John about getting my money back. But the idea, though, is that they're pretty much, there's not a lot going on out there, and nobody really goes out there. And so that's kind of when I get to Fort Ord to show the difference of exactly where we are today and why that's a good thing. These are just kind of some of the basics, some of the main things you're going to want to be going on at a closed landfill. Some of the things, such as site maintenance in terms of the roads, the slopes, that type of thing, or the gates, making sure it's secure, but that somebody essentially is going out there and making sure this thing is still there, that it's still okay, that, there's not, because after a while, I've been to a lot of these, and there are strange things that happen out there I'll talk a little bit about. But also the gas monitoring, they're required to supply drainage and erosion control, leachate control, site security, a final cover, at least 2 feet. We'll kind of get into that a little more, but something that's going to be, very sturdy, not going to cause you problems. You're not going to have to come out and keep fixing every 6 months. Post-closure land use is also another big component of closed landfills, obviously, is that for not so much in our county, but in a lot of counties, space is pretty limited, and there's going to want to be encroachment on a lot of these landfills. And how the landfill is constructed at the final point when the operator still has that closure funding is going to make a big difference, and how they leave it, what state they leave it in. And also, they undergo quarterly or annual, even biannual, apparently. I was talking with Jacques Graber, the waste board that handles the closure with us. This is the former Fort Ord landfill. And as you can see already, there's a nice road running. This is across one of the cells that's nearest to Fort Ord's in a very interesting position now. It's a huge site, but it's kind of really bumps up to a lot of different things. And one of the things on this far side here is the Cal State University at Monterey Bay. As you can imagine, there's a lot of very idealistic people that have probably not the best view of the Army or the federal government or any government, but so they're kind of very watchful of this site, and they happen to be right back behind there. But you can see already that there's quite a bit of attention paid to this site just by looking at, some of the gas monitoring wells. These aren't compliance probes, but they are, they're probes in the center of the site that kind of help characterize what kind of gas is being pulled in or pushed out of the system, depending on, atmospheric conditions or what the landfill's generating. But also you can see, a really great vegetative growth layer. And the best thing about Fort Ord is that it really blends in. It really kind of has tried to really get back to the way the topography, the geography was before there was a site there, especially with the flora and fauna really have come back pretty strong. So that's a great thing about this site. So site maintenance, just to kind of, this picture kind of shows a little bit of how this road is very accessible, very well maintained, and cuts right around the side. We can drive around it easily. It's a pretty big site, but it's great to be able to drive around, do a probe, hop out, test one, see what the methane levels are. Okay, fine, let's walk across a cell, see how the cover's holding up, and then you get back in and keep driving. It is a requirement that you're able to access, all the way around the site, especially if there's a fire or emergency, that type of thing, that the trucks or the maintenance people and equipment can get out there. Entry points I kind of bring up because it's also important to have a good gate that somebody can get in. which kind of becomes a situation at some of our closed landfills. Another funny thing that I find about closed landfills is that they can be closed for decades, and people don't quite seem to understand that it's closed. So they'll drive up and still be surprised that after 20 years it's closed and dump things at the gate or something like that. So that's another kind of a thing that usually with our closed landfills we have to keep an eye on and make sure that they're kind of maintaining the roadways even outside their property, because it creates a serious nuisance. But and of course the slopes, obviously you don't want to have any failures there which could cause damage, daylighting of waste, shifting of the landfill, or the differential settlement there that can cause those type of issues, and even damage, monitoring probes, that type of thing. So you want to be sure that the slopes are well maintained. And at this site, thanks to the very good vegetative cover, they are, that's not an issue. And I'm going to kind of gloss over a little bit. I'm not going to get in a lot of detail about Fort Ord because Derek Lieberman is going to be kind of focusing on that a little bit. My main point is to show how they're different, how much more care you see is in this kind of a photograph as opposed to Soledad, where nobody even goes out there. Fort Ord, for the past couple years, there's been basically a consultant living on site that basically does weekly inspections. They're out there all the time doing gas monitoring. I meet them every time at their trailer out there. They even have a control where we sign in and they know who's on site. So it's almost like the closest thing to an operating facility that we have in a closed setting. They do at Fort Ord, the visual inspections weekly, an annual inspection by a professional engineer. We go out there quarterly, and they, check for, of course, erosion, and part of that fauna, having everything come back, is good, but it also means that there is, a bit of damage out there. They'll get badgers digging holes, coyotes, earwigs, black widows, really, pretty wild stuff, college students. And they do perimeter probe monitoring, quarterly for methane, annually for VOCs, that type of thing, which is important for gas, obviously. Those are the major ways a closed landfill is going to impact the surroundings, is basically because of gas or water contamination. That's how it's going to escape the site and affect a lot of the surrounding community. Not a lot of people are itching to build right on a landfill in our cases, but definitely the surrounding areas, especially with Fort Ord, that's where your impacts are going to come from. So that's the really key thing to keep an eye on, especially, for example, in Fort Ord, there's been kind of a history of some water contamination, like with trichloroethylene, TCE, whatever. I mean, you don't want to be drinking acronyms. So it's basically, but they've gone through a lot of trouble, taken a lot of expense to do the testing and actually do the remediation. So fortunately, the Army has been really great at that, as we'll see. And of course, continued operation and extraction, a treatment system for the gas, which, as we'll see in the next slide, they have a very fancy new, this is new for this year, it just kind of went up and got up and running, their landfill gas flare system. They had an older one, but then they really kind of upped the stakes and put out more finger probes over the top of the landfill to collect more gas and bring them to a very fancy new electronic system, the little HAL system, obviously, the periodic sampling down here below we have, that's one of the monitoring wells around the edge. They're required to have every 1,000 feet around the perimeter of the landfill monitoring probes. And sometimes, it'll be closer to the property boundary. Sometimes it can be closer to the landfill. That's the funny thing about it, is sometimes if if you're getting a hit and you're a little too close to the landfill, you can move out, and get closer to the property boundary as long as, you're within your property boundary. It's kind of, to me, that's kind of funny. It's like, oh, we got a hit. How about here? How about here? As long as you're okay at your property boundary, that's fine. I mean, I think, and the LEL there and UEL are the lower explosive limit and upper explosive limit, if you're not familiar with that, which is for methane, 5 to 15% concentration by volume in air. That's when it's explosive. So if you're getting a 5 to 15% level at the property boundary, you have a problem that they need to solve immediately. But at Fort Ord, I mean, they're always pretty much zero. They have a really great system there where the system really keeps the values very low. And here's some examples of their drainage and erosion systems. The ditching here. This is, the waste is here. This is kind of a culvert that keeps water, like storm water, running on top of the landfill, and diverts it away so that even though these landfills or these mods are capped for the most part, it'll keep the water running away from them, so there's less chance of any leachate production through percolation through the landfill. Doing this also helps with maintaining integrity of the landfill, minimizing slope failure, preventing leachate production, that type of thing, and obviously keeping it from contact with the public. So here's kind of a little before picture of, it's got a nice example of just some different techniques that are used, fiber rolls here, just to kind of help with stability, and vegetative growth, the ditches to keep and these aprons and outlets, these things to keep the water flowing in the right direction, kind of away from the landfill when it's not coming in contact. And also, a very good road there that's very accessible to even the larger equipment that sometimes has to go out there. Now, they really change over time, and then the longer you go out there, the really less recognizable it gets, and it's only because you remember what it looked like before. So you really get this nice situation where it's pretty dramatic. You want to see something on there, something very solid, especially as these little shrubs really hang on. They're super tough, and they're used to kind of the lower precipitation at the coast, and they're there all year round, and they keep the landfill maintained. And here's an example of the security fence, just to kind of touch on that briefly. It's a very important thing. I mean, we do have situations where sometimes, like I say, when I first started going out there, college students would sometimes go out there and whatever, smoke or, I don't know, set things on fire. But you don't really want people out there, doing anything. I mean, we have had situations in other areas where they'll dirt bike. They do look like prime ground for that, but it actually can cause tens of thousands of dollars in damage. And it's really not something that operators need. We want them to get the landfill to this kind of state and not have to really incur any further costs beyond monitoring and making sure that's under control. So site security is very important. And final cover graded to promote runoff. Obviously, this is in general, not just at Fort Ord, but minimum of 2 feet thick, and generally with an impermeable layer on top, that type of thing. Should function with minimum maintenance, of course. Like I said, you don't want to be going back out there. Of course, the point is to reduce the impacts to public health and safety. Keep this thing in a tight little box. You don't want anything escaping, really, just like an operating site. You don't want any dust or litter, whatever odors really getting off if you can help it. And of course, consider post-closure land uses, which is the last little issue I'm going to talk about here, because post-closure land use, especially in the sites we have, it's best to keep them open space uses, parks. Golf courses are big, but usually our rich people don't want to play where our closed landfills are. They want to play in the, on the peninsula. But enclosed structures, the structural engineering and monitoring are very special for that. If you have, a system on site, they'll want to have the venting systems underneath the building to make sure the gas is directed away from it. But actually, you have to be careful sometimes. I actually heard of a situation where it was installed backwards and was actually pumping it into the building. But at least they had the monitoring to tell we're getting a really high amount of methane in here. So, but things like that have to be considered. But as far as so far, we've been fortunate not to have to really go there. And of course, all post-closure activity must be approved by the LEA, which I bring up because that does happen where you'll have. We had a situation once where we had a closed landfill and. I was taking somebody out there for the first time, kind of introducing them to the LEA program. I'm like, yeah, the closed landfills are great. We get to go all over the county. It's beautiful outside, and there's usually nothing happen out there. You just go make sure, and everything's cool. And then, we're parked out there, and I'm showing them where it is. And then a big city truck starts driving up, full of green waste, and, dumps it right on the landfill. And I'm like, oh, God. So we go over, and, I'm like, what are you doing there, Sparky? And he goes, well, yeah, they told us to come out here. This is where we dump the material, and that's, that's supposed to be fine. And I go, well, not really, but it could be worse, I guess. And I said, well, what do you do with it? I don't see a lot of it out here. Where is it going? He goes, oh, the fire department comes out here. They practice putting out fires with the green waste. And I said, well, who's your boss? And I had a bit of a conversation with him when I came back, but you got to kind of keep track of things like that because that's also an issue. So, make sure you approve the, that you do, especially the ones that are a little less obvious, if you have any within your jurisdictions, that you kind of keep track of them, because they may not necessarily, I mean, Fort Ord would definitely contact us, especially with everyone right around them, but someplace out in like Parkfield or Lockwood, King City, Greenfield, that's not going to happen. So, that you got to keep a good pulse on each of them. And kind of finally, the thing I wanted to mention is in terms of kind of wrapping this all together and the point of all this, these control measures and what we do to make these things safe kind of comes down to future development, and even to the point where it may not be right on top of the landfill, but as I say, the gas and water contamination isn't going to stay within the property boundaries. It's going to expand out. And so in Monterey County, we are developing a landfill buffer zone ordinance that kind of, depending on the situation, limits how close you can develop to a site, given that you are as close, the closer you get to it, you're kind of incurring more risk in terms of what may happen. Basically, like as it says there, it's basically an attempt to minimize public interaction with landfills, and that's basically my last slide here, is because the Fort Ord landfill kind of sits in the middle of a lot of action. There's marinas up here. This is kind of seaside area down here. Salinas is back there. And Fort Ord is this gigantic chunk. And these little, I just kind of, I don't want you to see any, don't read it. But just to look at some of the way it's being carved up and how kind of the landfill is in the middle of it. And fortunately, they've taken a lot of precautions to really, like I say, do a lot of testing, have the engineers on site. They have a lot of public meetings, that type of thing. Derek will go more into that. But it is important to make sure that these safeguards are in place, due to the fact that most of the time development is going to be happening right on the doorstep. That's it for me. I have some contact information. Guess we can move on to Derek.